The low hum of chatter filled the air as Tom Cruise stepped into the cozy, dimly lit restaurant in downtown Los Angeles. It was a Tuesday night, the kind where the city felt a little quieter than usual. Tom had just wrapped up a long day of meetings, and he wanted nothing more than a quiet meal to unwind. The small, upscale restaurant he'd chosen was the perfect place. It had the kind of charm that drew in locals rather than tourists. Tucked away in a quiet corner of the city, it wasn't the kind of place where the paparazzi would ever think to follow him. He was greeted by a hostess who led him to a small corner booth. As he walked past the tables, he couldn't help but notice a girl sitting near the far end of the room. She was young, maybe in her early 20s, with long dark hair pulled into a loose ponytail. Her clothes were simple, a faded t-shirt, jeans and sneakers. Nothing that would catch anyone's attention in a place like this. But there was something about her posture, the way she sat with her hands nervously fidgeting in her lap, that made Tom pause for a moment. He shrugged it off, taking a seat by the window and scanning the menu, though his mind wasn't entirely focused on what he was going to order. The girl's presence, the quiet intensity about her, lingered in the back of his mind. As he sipped on his water, the door to the kitchen swung open, and a waiter approached his table. "What can I get for you tonight, Mr. Cruise?" the waiter asked, his tone professional, but with an undertone of excitement. Tom smiled, appreciative of the subtle respect. Before he could respond, a soft voice interrupted the moment. "Excuse me, everyone." It was the girl from the corner. Tom turned to look at her again. She stood up from her table, a guitar case slung over her shoulder. She glanced around the room, a nervous smile tugging at her lips. The atmosphere in the restaurant shifted immediately. Conversation slowed, and the clinking of silverware against plates seemed to fade into the background. Everyone turned their attention toward her. She hesitated for a moment, her eyes scanning the room as if looking for something, or someone. The silence hung heavy in the air, and then with a deep breath, she began to speak. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but it carried through the room. "My name is Emily, and I'm here to sing for you tonight. I'm hoping you'll listen and maybe help me out." Tom's curiosity was piqued. The room had fallen silent. It wasn't every day you saw a young woman like her standing up in the middle of a nice restaurant, announcing her intentions to perform for a room full of strangers. There was something raw in her vulnerability that caught his attention. But then she gave a small, nervous laugh, her fingers tapping on the guitar case. "I know this sounds strange," she continued, "but I'm raising money for my grandfather's surgery. He's sick, and we don't have enough to cover the costs. If you can help, I'd be so grateful." Tom felt his heart tug at the sincerity in her voice. This wasn't just about performing. This was about a girl doing whatever she could to save the person she loved most. There was a weight behind her words, something that made the quiet room hold its breath, waiting for what would come next. The waiter moved to the side, sensing the shift in energy, but the moment lingered. Emily opened her guitar case and pulled out a well-worn acoustic guitar. As she strummed the first chord, the melody filled the room, delicate and tentative. She began to sing, her voice soft but unmistakably powerful, carrying a sense of urgency that made the entire restaurant lean in. Her song was one of love, desperation, and hope, a haunting ballad about doing whatever it takes for family, for the people you cherish, and for the kind of bonds that can't be broken by money or time. Tom's attention sharpened. His thoughts wandered for a moment, reflecting on his own family. He remembered his mother's struggles when he was young, the times when his family had to make ends meet. His heart softened, and he leaned forward slightly, watching Emily pour every ounce of emotion into her performance. The song continued, and the room seemed to fade away. The only thing that existed was the sound of Emily's voice, and the quiet strumming of her guitar. Each note felt like a plea, each word a prayer. It wasn't until the final chord rang out, echoing in the stillness, that the restaurant came back to life. Applause erupted around the room, but Emily only stood there, looking down at her shoes, as if unsure whether she had earned the response or not. Tom's mind was still racing. He didn't know why, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just another ordinary encounter. Something told him that this girl, this moment, would lead to something far bigger than anyone could have predicted. As the applause died down, Emily stood motionless, her guitar resting against her chest like a shield. The clapping was polite, but there was something impersonal about it. The kind of clapping you give to someone who's done their part, but doesn't really expect to be the center of attention. The kind of applause that felt like an obligation, not admiration. Tom could see the way she was looking at the floor, her face flushed with both relief and embarrassment. She wasn't used to this. She wasn't seeking praise. Only the chance to make a difference for her grandfather, the man who had raised her since she was a child. The room had fallen back into its usual hum, the moment slipping away, but Tom didn't look away. He couldn't. There was something about Emily that made it impossible to ignore her. It wasn't just the raw emotion in her voice, the honesty of her words. It was the way she carried herself, this quiet strength that was masked by her youthful vulnerability. She had no grand gestures, no dramatic plea for help. She had simply stood there and poured her heart out, hoping for something more than empty pity. Tom's hand was still on his glass of water, but he didn't drink. He just stared at her, trying to reconcile the young woman before him with the story she had just shared. A girl so determined to save her family. There was something familiar in that determination, something that resonated deep within him. His own mind wandered back to his younger days. Growing up in a modest household, his parents worked hard to keep food on the table. There were moments when they struggled, moments when the weight of their bills seemed like too much to bear. But they always found a way to push through, always kept their heads above water. His mother especially had taught him the value of family and sacrifice. The idea that you could never give up on the people you love, no matter the cost. He snapped out of his thoughts when he realized the waiter had approached him again. "Mr. Cruz," the waiter said, this time with a sense of urgency. "Would you like to order now or?" Tom smiled faintly, his mind still on Emily. He wasn't sure why, but the moment she'd just created seemed to echo in his chest, reverberating with something he couldn't quite place. "No, I think I'll wait," Tom replied, his voice steady but distant. The waiter nodded, clearly not knowing what had shifted in the atmosphere, and retreated. Tom's eyes flicked back to Emily. She was now sitting down again at her table, her guitar resting beside her. Her eyes were downcast, a faint flush still coloring her cheeks. Tom saw the way she clutched the edge of her seat, almost as if she were holding herself together. The woman before him wasn't just a musician or a daughter trying to raise money for her grandfather's surgery. She was someone who had been carrying this weight for a long time, long before this restaurant performance. She was someone who had learned that the world doesn't always hand out opportunities. You have to fight for them. Suddenly, Tom's curiosity got the best of him. He stood up, his chair scraping lightly against the floor. He didn't know why he felt this pull toward her. Maybe it was because of the courage she had shown. Maybe it was because he saw a reflection of his own younger self in her. But whatever it was, it made him move. He crossed the room slowly, his gaze never leaving her. As he approached, he saw her stiffen slightly, as if she anticipated being approached, but wasn't sure by whom. She lifted her head, her eyes meeting his. "Hi," Tom said, his voice warm, but with a hint of concern. "I just wanted to say that was beautiful." She looked up at him, surprised, as if she hadn't expected anyone to stop by. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft, almost apologetic, as if she didn't deserve the compliment. "You're very brave," he added, his eyes searching hers. "I know what it's like to do everything you can for someone you love. I admire your dedication." For a moment, they both stood in silence, the weight of the conversation hanging between them. She swallowed, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her napkin. I have to make it work, you know? My grandfather's everything to me. I can't lose him. I don't have a choice." Tom's heart tightened at the words. It reminded him of his own experiences with family, with the love and sacrifice that had shaped him into the person he was today. "I understand," he said, his voice softer now. "Sometimes we do whatever we can to help those we care about, even if it feels impossible." She nodded, but there was a sadness in her eyes that Tom couldn't ignore. "The surgery costs so much. I'm doing everything I can to raise the money, but it's hard." She paused, looking down at her hands. "I'm afraid I won't be able to raise enough in time." Tom looked at her closely, his mind racing. He knew what it was like to feel like time was running out, to want to help but not know how. The fact that she was here, singing for strangers to help her grandfather, spoke volumes about her love and determination. "You're doing the right thing," he said firmly. "I can see how much you care. That kind of love, that kind of effort always counts." Emily met his gaze again, her eyes searching his face as though trying to read him. For a moment, there was a flicker of hope in her expression. Maybe she was wondering if there was someone out there who could help her in the way she so desperately needed. Maybe she saw in Tom someone who had the means, the ability, to make a difference. But Tom wasn't thinking about how he could help her just yet. He wasn't thinking about the money. Instead, he was focused on her courage, her determination. There was something about this girl, something about the way she believed in family and love, that stirred something deep inside him. As they stood there, the weight of the moment was undeniable. There were too many questions left unanswered, too many layers to peel back. The story of Emily and her grandfather was only beginning. And for Tom, the idea that he could play a part in it, even in the smallest way, was a thought he couldn't shake. The next day, Tom couldn't shake the image of Emily out of his mind. He had gone about his usual routine, but there was a lingering sense of unease. His encounter with her at the restaurant wasn't something he could simply dismiss. Her quiet desperation, the weight of her words, they had burrowed into his thoughts, leaving him wondering what he could do to help. He tried to move past it. After all, he was a busy man. There were meetings to attend, scripts to review, and events to plan. But something about Emily's story haunted him. There were too many unanswered questions about her situation, about her grandfather, about her life. The more he thought about it, the more he realized he hadn't even asked her what her grandfather's condition was, or why the surgery was so critical. The only thing he knew was that she was doing everything in her power to raise money. Tom had always believed in the power of family. He'd seen the sacrifices his parents made for him and his siblings. His mother, especially, had always put family first no matter the cost. And Emily, her devotion to her grandfather reminded him of that same strength. It was raw, pure, and unyielding. And yet, she was struggling to make ends meet, trying to raise a sum of money that felt far beyond her reach. Later that afternoon, Tom found himself browsing through the list of contacts on his phone, searching for someone who could help him make a difference. He considered calling one of his business associates, someone who might be able to help with a financial donation. But something told him that throwing money at the problem wouldn't solve anything. He needed to know more about Emily's story, to understand what was truly at stake. But getting involved in her personal life was a different matter entirely. That evening, Tom returned to the restaurant where he had first seen Emily perform. The dim lights, the intimate setting, it all felt oddly familiar now. The manager greeted him as if he'd been there 1,000 times before. But Tom wasn't interested in small talk. "I'm looking for a girl who performed here last night," he said, his voice casual, but with an undercurrent of curiosity. "Emily, I think her name was." The manager nodded. "Ah yes, Emily. She sings here regularly. She's one of our part-time performers. She's been coming in for a few months now, mostly to raise money for her grandfather's surgery, I believe." "Do you know anything more about her?" Tom asked, leaning in slightly, his voice lowering. "She seems well, she's in a tough situation." The manager hesitated, glancing around before lowering his voice. "She's a good kid. Her grandfather raised her after her parents died in a car accident when she was just a child. He's all she has left. I don't know much about his condition, but I know she's been trying to scrape together money for his surgery for a while now. I've heard her sing many times. She's got a lot of heart. But I'm afraid she's running out of time." The manager's words hit Tom hard. He hadn't realized just how deep Emily's struggles ran. It wasn't just the money that was holding her back. It was time. Time was something neither she nor her grandfather had much of. And with every passing day, the chances of her grandfather getting the surgery he needed seemed to slip further and further away. Tom turned to leave but hesitated, his hand on the door. There was something else the manager had said that didn't sit right with him. "Do you know where I can find her outside of here? Any other places she performs or works?" The manager raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by Tom's sudden interest. "I'm not sure. She keeps to herself mostly. But I do know she's been working odd jobs around the city. Sometimes she'll sing at different places, but it's usually just small gigs. Never anything consistent. Tom nodded, thanking the manager before leaving the restaurant. It was clear now that Emily wasn't just performing to raise money. She was running herself ragged, trying to keep up with multiple jobs, while carrying the weight of her grandfather's illness on her shoulders. The strain was beginning to show, not just in her voice, but in her demeanor. She was worn out, tired beyond belief, and it was evident that she didn't know where else to turn. 2 days later, Tom found himself at the edge of the city, in a rundown part of town that didn't quite match the glitz and glamour of Hollywood. He parked his car in a small lot and looked around. The neighborhood was quieter than he expected, a place where people didn't have much, but made do with what they had. He spotted Emily sitting outside a small cafe, a guitar case at her side, her face drawn and tired. She was sipping coffee, staring off into the distance. Her clothes were the same as before, a simple t-shirt and jeans, and she looked like she hadn't slept in days. Tom's heart tightened at the sight. She wasn't just fighting for her grandfather's life. She was fighting her own battle too. He approached her slowly, unsure of how to begin. She didn't seem to notice him until he was right in front of her. When her eyes met his, they were weary, but they softened when she recognized him. "Tom," she said, offering a small smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I didn't expect to see you again." Tom smiled back. "I couldn't stop thinking about you, Emily. About what you're going through. I wanted to see if there was anything I could do." She shook her head, her expression turning more somber. "There's nothing anyone can do, Tom. It's just too much. I've been trying for so long, and I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this. My grandfather is getting weaker every day, and I feel like I'm running out of time." Tom sat down across from her, his gaze steady. "I know it seems impossible, but you don't have to do this alone. You're not alone in this fight." She looked at him, tears welling up in her eyes, and for a moment, she seemed like she might break. But she quickly blinked them away, pushing her emotions down. "I've tried everything, Tom. The money, the gigs, everything. But nothing is enough. I can't do it. I'm scared." Tom reached across the table, his hand resting gently on hers. "We'll figure this out. Together." But even as he said the words, Tom knew that the road ahead wasn't going to be easy. Emily's determination and her fight for her grandfather's life were admirable, but there were too many obstacles standing in their way. Time, money, and the medical bills were a trio of challenges they couldn't simply wish away. Tom knew that if they were going to have any chance at success, they would have to fight harder than they ever had before. But he was ready for it. For Emily, for her grandfather, and for the hope that sometimes, against all odds, miracles could happen. The following week, Tom found himself pulling more strings than he had ever planned. But Emily's situation was unlike anything he had encountered before. It wasn't just about the money. It was about a person's dignity, about a family clinging to the last vestiges of hope. He knew the world didn't hand out opportunities. It made you fight for them, sometimes at the cost of everything you had. But he didn't realize how deep the web of obstacles was until he began helping Emily directly. What had initially seemed like a straightforward request, a little financial help, quickly spiraled into something much more complex. Emily's days were becoming more grueling. She had started working double shifts at a local diner and taking on extra gigs at small bars and coffee shops. But the bills kept stacking up. Every dollar she earned barely put a dent in the cost of her grandfather's surgery, and the medical bills were coming due faster than she could manage. Every time she checked her bank account, the balance seemed to drop lower, the chances of her getting the surgery on time seeming slimmer. When Tom reached out, she tried to hide her frustration, but it was obvious that the pressure was starting to break her. Her energy was fading, and the weight of it all was becoming unbearable. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay. And when Tom offered his help, at first, she rejected it outright. "I can't ask you for that kind of help," Emily said one evening after their brief conversation. "You don't even know me. I don't want to just take your money. That's not what I'm about." Tom had been persistent, not in a way that felt intrusive, but in a way that showed he truly cared. "It's not just about the money, Emily. It's about giving you a fighting chance, about helping you when you're fighting so hard already. She had finally relented, but the emotional strain of it all had caused her to grow more guarded. Each time they spoke, she seemed more distant, more closed off. She didn't want to burden him. The reality was that the more help Tom tried to offer, the more isolated she became. At the same time, Tom was facing obstacles of his own. Despite his success, he realized that the path he had taken to help Emily wasn't as straightforward as it seemed. His celebrity status could open doors, but it could also make things complicated. When he began reaching out to influential figures in his network, many responded with polite dismissals. Everyone was willing to throw around words of support, but when it came down to actually parting with money or committing to a cause, the responses were less enthusiastic. It was frustrating for Tom. He had hoped that people who were in positions of power, who had the resources, would rally behind Emily's cause. But the truth was that most of them were busy with their own agendas. It became clear to Tom that many of these people didn't care, unless there was something in it for them. They didn't see Emily's fight the way he did, as a fight for survival, not just for money. There was a turning point one afternoon, when Tom met with a wealthy philanthropist, one who had the resources to help in a big way. At first, the meeting seemed promising. The philanthropist had expressed genuine interest in Emily's story, and Tom thought that finally, they were on the verge of a breakthrough. But just as Tom began to outline the plan to secure the funds, the philanthropist interrupted. "Look, Tom, I get it. Your heart's in the right place. But I can't justify putting my money into something that doesn't have a clear, guaranteed outcome. You know how it is in my world. People donate for causes that are measurable, not for a single person's emergency surgery." Tom felt a surge of frustration, but kept his voice steady. This isn't just about the surgery. It's about a person who's dedicated her life to caring for her grandfather. This isn't a case of charity. This is about doing the right thing. The philanthropist raised an eyebrow. "You're asking me to risk my resources on a gamble. You should know better than that, Tom." The conversation ended soon after that, leaving Tom more disillusioned than before. It wasn't the first time he had seen the greed and self-interest that controlled the higher echelons of society, but it was the first time he had been so personally affected by it. Emily's fight had become his own in ways he hadn't anticipated. Meanwhile, Emily's life was rapidly spiraling. As she took on more shifts and worked even harder to make ends meet, her health began to deteriorate. Her exhaustion was starting to show, and it was clear that the long nights and sleepless hours were taking a toll. Her performances were no longer as energetic, and the hollow exhaustion in her voice made it harder for her to connect with the audience. The tips were smaller, and the money she earned from her singing gigs was barely enough to cover her rent, let alone the mounting medical bills. One night, after a particularly exhausting shift at the diner, Emily collapsed in the small apartment she shared with her grandfather. Her chest ached, and her vision blurred as she fought to stay awake long enough to check her phone. But even though she had been working nonstop for days, there were no new donations, no messages from potential sponsors or investors. She sat there feeling utterly defeated. The weight of everything, the uncertainty, the fear, was crashing down on her in a way she couldn't escape. Her grandfather's condition was getting worse, and the thought of losing him was unbearable. She had always promised him she wouldn't give up, no matter how hard things got. But in that moment, all she wanted was for the pain to stop. As she sat there in silence, Tom's call came through. She hesitated, unsure of whether she was ready to talk. But the exhaustion and loneliness won out, and she picked up. "Hello," she answered softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Emily." Tom's voice was kind, but there was a sense of urgency behind it. "I need you to listen to me. I've been trying to pull every string I can. I've reached out to some influential people who might be able to help. But there's something else we need to consider. I've been thinking about this all wrong. We can't just wait for the world to help. We need to make people care." Emily swallowed hard. "Tom, you don't understand. I've been trying. I'm doing everything I can. I'm running out of options. I can't keep going like this." "Listen," Tom interrupted. "I know it feels impossible right now, but I want to do something big for you. Something that shows people that this isn't just a charity case. This is a human being who deserves a chance. I don't have all the answers, but we're going to figure this out. Together. Emily was silent for a moment. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to hope that anyone, might step in and make a difference. But the reality was starting to sink in. Her situation wasn't just about money or connections. It was about survival, about fighting against a world that wasn't built for people like her. And even with Tom's best intentions, she wasn't sure there was enough time left. The days leading up to the final deadline for Emily's grandfather's surgery felt like a countdown to an inevitable tragedy. No matter how hard she worked, no matter how much she tried to hold on to the shred of hope that was left, time was slipping through her fingers like sand. Her body was exhausted, her spirit worn down, but her determination was unbreakable. And yet, it wasn't enough. The nights she spent in the tiny apartment with her grandfather, the long hours of nursing him, and praying for a miracle, were beginning to wear her thin. She could feel herself unraveling piece by piece. The phone calls had all gone unanswered, and the donors who had once promised to help were now quiet. The weight of the world was collapsing on her shoulders. She sat by her grandfather's bed one night, staring at the drip that had been his lifeline for the past few days. His breathing was shallow, and there was an alarming stillness about him that made her stomach turn with fear. She had always been the one to hold things together, but now, everything felt beyond her control. Her phone buzzed with a message. It was Tom. I'm coming over tonight. We need to talk. For the first time in days, Emily felt something stir within her. Maybe this time would be different. Maybe this time, someone could help her turn things around. She quickly responded, though her fingers trembled slightly. Okay. The message seemed to offer a brief flicker of hope, but as the minutes passed, the weight of her reality sank deeper into her bones. She could feel the panic rising in her chest, the dread that no matter what Tom did, no matter how hard anyone tried, it might not be enough to save her grandfather. When Tom arrived at Emily's apartment that evening, the dim light from the hallway cast long shadows across the small living room. He knocked lightly, as though unsure whether he should disturb the quiet solitude that had enveloped the place. Emily opened the door, her face a mask of exhaustion, but there was a glimmer of something else in her eyes, a spark of determination, though worn and fragile. Hey, Tom said softly, stepping into the room. How's he doing? Emily swallowed hard. Not good. He's getting worse by the hour. The doctors gave us a week, Tom. Just a week. Tom's heart clenched. He could see the tears threatening to spill from Emily's eyes, but she was fighting them back, fighting the urge to fall apart in front of him. But he could see it in the way she moved, the way she spoke, the way she held her grandfather's frail hand, as if she were terrified he might slip away right then and there. I need to do something, Tom said, his voice firm with resolve. He was pacing now, his mind working fast, calculating what needed to be done. I've got people I can reach out to, connections. We'll do whatever it takes. We can get the money together. We can make it happen. Emily shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. Tom, I've been trying so hard. And nothing's working. The surgery, it's too expensive. And I don't have enough time left. What's the point of bringing in more people, if I can't even get the people I know to help? Her words stung him, not because they were meant to hurt, but because she was right. The world wasn't fair. People like her, struggling every day just to survive, were often invisible to those who had the power to help. And Tom had seen that firsthand, from the wealthy philanthropist to the indifferent donors. All of them giving lip service, but nothing of substance. Then we need to think bigger, Tom said, his voice growing more intense. I'm not just going to let him slip away. I'm not going to let you lose him, Emily. She looked up at him, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust that anyone could help. But the cold reality settled in her chest, weighing her down. What do you mean bigger? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. I'm going to do something big, Tom said, standing tall. His eyes locked onto hers, full of determination. A fundraiser. Not just any fundraiser, but one that draws attention. We'll use social media, the press. We'll put your story out there. Your fight, your grandfather's story. People will hear it. They'll care. We'll bring in enough money for the surgery. Emily opened her mouth to protest, but Tom cut her off. I know it's a risk, he said. But it's the only shot we've got. We'll make people care. We'll make them see what's at stake. Not just the surgery but everything that comes with it. The family, the love, the sacrifice. We'll show them the real story. For a moment, Emily just stood there, taking in his words. There was no guarantee it would work, no certainty that this would be enough. But in Tom's eyes, she saw a fire she hadn't seen in herself for days. Maybe she had been too focused on the small, quiet steps. Maybe she needed to take a leap of faith, just like he was suggesting. Okay, she whispered. Let's do it. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Tom put his plan into action, pulling strings in every direction. The media caught wind of the fundraiser, and soon, there were interviews and press releases. News outlets picked up the story. A young woman working tirelessly to save her grandfather's life. A beloved actor rallying behind her cause. Social media exploded. People from all over the world began sharing Emily's story, offering their support, their donations. Emily couldn't believe what was happening. The money began rolling in, small donations from ordinary people, each one carrying with it a message of hope. It wasn't just the money that overwhelmed her. It was the fact that people genuinely cared. Strangers were willing to help, to rally behind her fight. But as the donations grew, so did the pressure. Emily felt the weight of it all pressing down on her. She was scared. What if it wasn't enough? What if the surgery came too late? Every time the phone buzzed with a new donation, it felt like a temporary reprieve. But it wasn't a guarantee. The clock was still ticking. And then in the middle of all the chaos, Tom got a call from the surgeon. The surgery could be scheduled, but it came with one catch. The medical center needed the full payment up front. The fundraiser had raised more than Emily could have hoped for, but they were still short. It wasn't enough. Tom's pulse quickened. He could feel the walls closing in, the pressure mounting. The stakes had never been higher. The call from the surgeon echoed in Tom's ears. The full payment was due today. Without it, Emily's grandfather wouldn't be able to have the surgery. Everything they had worked for, all the effort, all the sleepless nights, would be for nothing. Tom stood still for a moment, his hand clutching the phone like it was a lifeline. Emily, sitting quietly next to him, was staring at the floor. She knew what the surgeon had said. She knew what that meant. It wasn't enough. A sinking feeling washed over her. Tom, we've tried everything. I can't ask people for more. I don't want to turn this into some kind of circus, she said, her voice breaking. Tom's gaze softened as he turned to her. I don't care how we do it, Emily. We're not giving up. We're this close. I know people. And if it takes everything I have to make this work, I'll do it. But even Tom's confidence couldn't change the one thing they both knew. There wasn't enough time. The deadline was here, and there were no more ways to raise the money. They needed a miracle. Then, just as Tom was about to step out, an idea hit him like a lightning bolt. His gut told him it wasn't going to be easy, but it was the only option left. I have an idea, he said, his voice suddenly firm. It's risky, but it might just work. Emily lifted her head. What is it? Without waiting for an answer, Tom made a few quick calls, his voice becoming more urgent with each passing minute. He reached out to his contacts, people he had never once asked for favors. But this wasn't just any request. This was for Emily, for her grandfather. He wasn't going to let them lose this battle. Within the hour, Tom had secured a match for the remaining funds. But the catch was steep. It wasn't a donation, it was a loan. A wealthy investor had agreed to cover the difference. But they would require something in return. The terms were clear. Tom's name, and the media attention, would have to be used to publicize the investor's involvement. It was a deal that Tom had always avoided, one that made his skin crawl. But what other choice did they have? Tom explained the terms to Emily, and she understood the gravity of the situation. Her heart ached at the thought of turning her personal struggle into something so public. But she also knew that the time for pride was long gone. Her grandfather needed the surgery, and she would do whatever it took to make that happen. I'll do it, Emily said, her voice stronger now. We don't have any other choice. It's all for him. Tom nodded, a sense of urgency gripping his chest. They had only hours to finalize the deal and get the necessary funds. Every second felt like a ticking bomb. As Emily prepared herself for the inevitable media exposure, Tom arranged everything behind the scenes, coordinating with the surgeon's office and the investor. The fundraiser had done its part, and with the loan now in place, Emily finally had the money she needed. The feeling of relief was almost surreal, but the reality was that there was still a lot of work ahead. But for now, at least, they had made it past the biggest hurdle. As they sat in the hospital waiting room later that evening, waiting for news of the surgery, Emily couldn't help but glance at Tom. Despite the tension that still hung in the air, she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. "Thank you, Tom. I don't know how I can ever repay you for this." Tom smiled gently. "You don't have to repay me. You've already done more than enough. You've shown me something I didn't know I needed to see." Emily frowned. "What do you mean?" Tom's eyes twinkled. "You've shown me the power of hope, and the strength of a person's will to fight for what they love. I never expected to be part of something like this." And in that moment, as Emily looked at the man who had made it all possible, she realized something. She had learned the most important lesson of all. The true worth of a person isn't measured by how much they have, but by how much they're willing to give, even when it seems like there's nothing left to offer. The surgery was a success. It had been a tense few hours, the kind of waiting that gnaws at the very core of a person. But when the doctor emerged from the operating room with a smile on his face, and a report that Emily's grandfather had made it through the procedure, it was like a weight had been lifted from Emily's shoulders. The relief was overwhelming, and all the nights of worry, the panic, the uncertainty, it all seemed worth it in that single precious moment. She turned to Tom, who had been with her the entire time, his quiet support more valuable than words could express. "Thank you," Emily said, tears brimming in her eyes, her voice barely above a whisper. Tom gave her a reassuring smile, though he knew the fight wasn't over. The surgery was just the beginning. Her grandfather's recovery would take time, and Emily still had to navigate the aftermath of the deal with the investor. A deal that, while saving her grandfather's life, had come with its own set of complications. As the days passed, Emily's life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. Her grandfather rested, recovering, while she continued to work, and the buzz from the fundraising efforts began to settle down. The media attention, which had once felt like an overwhelming beast, was starting to fade, leaving Emily with a sense of quiet gratitude. But the looming question of the investor and the deal she had made still hung over her head. Emily had always prided herself on her independence, and the idea of owing someone something, especially in such a public way, gnawed at her. She had promised Tom she would do whatever it took, but now that the crisis had passed, the weight of that promise seemed heavier than ever. Tom, ever perceptive, had noticed the shift in her mood. One evening, after a long day at the hospital with her grandfather, Emily returned to her apartment to find Tom waiting for her with a quiet, yet serious expression on his face. "Hey," he greeted her, standing up from the couch where he had been flipping through his phone. "We need to talk." Emily felt a jolt of unease. "About what?" "The deal," Tom said, his voice calm but firm. "We need to figure out how to handle the investor. I know you've been feeling uncomfortable about the terms, and I can't help but feel like this whole situation is still unresolved for you." She ran her fingers through her hair, trying to find the right words. "It's just, I don't like feeling like I owe someone. The publicity, the loan. I agreed to it because I thought it was the only option. But now I'm not sure. It feels like I'm losing something that I fought so hard to hold on to." Tom stepped closer, his presence grounding her. "You're not losing anything, Emily. You've done something incredible. You fought for your grandfather, and you won. Don't let anyone make you feel like that's not enough." She met his gaze, her voice soft. "I know, but I don't want this to come with strings attached. I want to make sure my family is safe and free. I don't want to be caught up in someone else's debt or their expectations." Tom nodded, understanding the depth of her feelings. "What if I told you that we could clear that up? What if there was a way to undo the deal, or at least lessen the burden?" Emily looked at him, her heart swelling with hope but still laced with uncertainty. "How?" Tom smiled, pulling out his phone. "I've been working on something behind the scenes. I've been in contact with the investor. The terms were steep, but I've convinced them to give you a bit more flexibility. It's not perfect, but they're willing to adjust some of the deal in exchange for you continuing the fundraiser. You won't be under their thumb, and you won't owe them in the way you thought. Her breath caught in her throat. You mean, I don't have to go through with the whole media push? I don't have to keep publicizing their involvement? No, Tom said, his voice steady. You won't have to. I've made sure of it. They understand that this is your story, and it should be on your terms. You get to keep your dignity, Emily. Tears welled up in her eyes again, but this time, they weren't from fear or exhaustion. They were tears of relief, of gratitude for the man who had never stopped fighting for her, even when she wasn't sure how to fight for herself. Tom, you didn't have to do all this. He shrugged, his usual smile back. I've learned something from you, Emily. Sometimes helping people means doing what they need, not just what they want. And you needed a little help getting your power back. For a moment there was silence. Then, Emily laughed softly, the tension in her shoulders melting away. You really do know how to save the day, don't you? Tom grinned. Just doing my part. As they sat together, the weight of the last few weeks seemed to lift from her, like a heavy fog lifting to reveal clearer skies. Her grandfather would recover, and the future, while still uncertain, now felt full of possibilities. She had fought for him, for herself, and with Tom by her side, she had found the strength to face the future with a sense of hope that she hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't just about the money or the surgery anymore. It was about the people who stepped up, who cared when it mattered most. And for the first time in a long while, Emily believed that maybe, just maybe, she could truly handle whatever came next. Weeks passed, and the weight of uncertainty that had once hung so heavily over Emily and her grandfather seemed to have lifted. The deal with the investor was fully resolved, with much of the burden alleviated, and the media storm that had come with it faded into the background. Emily no longer felt like she was fighting a battle that wasn't hers to fight. Her grandfather was on the mend, his strength returning day by day, and her heart felt lighter than it had in months. She sat beside him now, watching him slowly sip a cup of tea, a gentle smile playing across his weathered face. There was a peace between them, one that hadn't been there before. The fear of losing him had taught Emily the true value of the time they had left together, and now, she cherished every moment. Emily, her grandfather said, his voice raspy but warm, I'm proud of you. You've done more than anyone could ever ask. Not just for me but for yourself too. I've watched you grow stronger, braver, more determined. She smiled, a touch of embarrassment coloring her cheeks. I just did what had to be done, Grandpa. You've always been there for me. I had to do the same for you. He shook his head gently. No, you did more. You gave everything you had, and then some. That's what makes you special. Tom had been a constant presence throughout this time. He had become not only a protector but a friend. Someone Emily could rely on without question. Despite everything, he had remained humble, never asking for recognition, never expecting praise. He had helped her without hesitation, never once seeking anything in return. One afternoon, as Emily walked through the park with her grandfather, she saw Tom waiting by the bench near the entrance. He was looking out over the pond, his hands in his pockets. As she approached, he turned to face her, and for a moment their eyes locked. Two people who had shared something deep, something personal, something transformative. Hey, she greeted him softly, the sunlight casting a warm glow on his face. Hey yourself, he said with a smile. How's he doing? Better every day, Emily replied. I don't know what we would have done without you, Tom. Tom shrugged, as if the whole thing had been no big deal. I was just doing what anyone would have done. I couldn't sit by and watch you struggle, especially knowing how much you care. Emily chuckled lightly, feeling the sincerity in his words. Well, you've definitely made a difference in my life. I don't think I could ever thank you enough. You don't have to, Tom said, his tone warm but serious. What I did was because I believe in what you stand for. You didn't give up, Emily. Even when everything seemed hopeless, you kept going. And that's what makes all the difference. For a long moment, they stood there together in silence, the quiet between them speaking volumes. There was no need for further words. They had both come through the storm, and now, they could simply enjoy the peace that had finally settled over them. As the days turned into weeks, Emily continued to help her grandfather through his recovery. She also found herself reflecting on the incredible journey she had gone through. How a girl, who had once been overwhelmed by life's challenges, had learned to stand strong and fight for what mattered most. She had discovered the value of community, the importance of persistence, and the true power of kindness. She glanced at Tom once more, and this time, she didn't just see him as the man who had helped her get through the hardest time of her life. She saw him as a reminder of the goodness in the world, the kind of person who gives without expecting anything in return. The truth was, people like Tom were rare. And as the sun set that evening, casting its golden light across the horizon, Emily felt a sense of calm she hadn't known before. She was no longer afraid of what might come next. She had everything she needed within her: hope, determination, and the knowledge that no matter what life threw her way, she could face it head on. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to start paying it forward.